Welcome and hope you are doing well. My name is Ogan Gorel and I'm presenting the ECCK COVID-19 update with practical tips for individuals and organizations. I know this is a very difficult time, but knowledge and getting to know as much as possible about this situation is extremely important. And I appreciate the opportunity by ECCK, European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, uh, Christoph Heider, Sven Erik Badenberg, and the staff for making this presentation possible. So we have the world before Corona and the world after Corona. We've seen the Summer Olympics postponed, stock market crashes, airlines grounded, social distancing, and of course, a personal tragedy by an increasing number of deaths. So this world has changed, and I want to give some knowledge as well as some practical tips during this presentation so that we can all, as individuals and organizations, adjust to this world after Corona. Most important take-home message is not to panic. And of course, a lack of information, a lack of facts can make it very easy to panic. And while we don't know everything, and the situation is rapidly evolving, I hope to share with you some basic knowledge. First of all, what is a virus? A virus is a package of genetic material. It is contained within an organic particle that invades living cells and uses the cell or host metabolic machinery to produce new virus particles. You can see that in the slide with the yellow particles. That is the virus. It's important to keep in mind that a virus is actually not alive. It is, as I mentioned, a particle, and that has important implications for treatment and for managing this virus. Let's look at the SARS coronavirus 2 in a little bit more detail, just as some basic background. The principles that I will be sharing with you in the next few moments will be important for the practical tips. So this is not just an academic exercise. There are three parts to the virus. The first is the spike protein on the surface. This protein determines the target. This protein is also blocked by antibodies, by the immune system, and is also part of the tests, some tests that are used to detect the virus, or so-called antibody tests. Then there is a greasy covering to the virus, and this is called the envelope. So this is a membrane envelope virus. And in the electron micrograph, you can see that the virus is not perfectly round, a little bit squishy. And so this virus is kind of like a soap bubble, and it's quite fragile, actually. And this envelope determines the environmental viability. Many things that destroy the virus destroy this envelope. The third part of the virus is indeed the genetic material in the inside of the package. This genetic material is RNA, which should be contrasted with DNA. RNA viruses are notorious for mutating, and that's a problem with this virus. And also, it's important to note that this RNA is used for other types of tests, most notably the PCR test. Again, is the virus alive? The virus is not alive. So we don't talk about killing the virus. There are two ways to get rid of the virus. One is to actually physically destroy it. And the second is the body's immune system to clear it from the body. So how long can the virus be viable on surfaces? In the air, it can be up to 3 hours. Copper, which has some antiviral properties, in 4 hours. But cardboard, plastic, and stainless steel for longer periods of time. You might have recalled that on the cruise ships, there were many cases of the virus, transmission as well as illness. And those ships had steel and plastic surfaces, and it's very important to keep these surfaces clean, as we'll describe shortly. So as I mentioned, the virus cannot be killed. It can be destroyed. And there are 4 ways to destroy the coronavirus, again, based on these components. The first one is with soap and water. As I mentioned, the virus has an envelope, and that envelope is like grease, and soap dissolves grease, and indeed, soap is very uh, effective in destroying the virus. So, washing hands for a minimum of 20 seconds. Alcohol is also effective in destroying the virus with a minimum concentration of 20% alcohol, uh, typically found in uh, alcohol sanitizers. And the effect of alcohol actually happens when it dries. So when you wash with the alcohol, you should let it dry before touching other things, and certainly before touching your face, which you should avoid. The third element is a bleach solution. This is not for the hands, of course, so 10% bleach, and this is for surfaces and other areas. And the fourth one is hydrogen peroxide. It is also not used for the hands, minimum of 3% peroxide. A very mild form of peroxide is often sold in stores as a spray, and that can be used also for orally, although it should not be overused. Again, hydrogen peroxide is not entirely suitable for personal use. It's again for surfaces. So I wanted to go over some epidemiologic concepts, and this chart summarizes two important concepts of transmissibility, also known as the R naught, and the mortality, also known as the case fatality rate. And on the horizontal axis, you can see the R naught, which is a measure of the transmissibility, the average number of people that will catch the disease from one person, and the vertical axis is the case fatality rate or mortality rate of the virus. And this is a chart of many viruses. As you can see, you've heard of these names: Ebola, MERS, which was in 2015, smallpox, which has been eradicated, polio, and down here you see measles, chickenpox, norovirus. So where is, uh, first of all, it should be noted that in general, there is an inverse relationship between the transmissibility and the mortality. Uh, High mortality is usually low transmissibility. More transmissible is usually less fatal. And so, where is the SARS coronavirus? It is right kind of in this middle. It is fairly um, transmissible. It also has a non negligible fatality rate. And this puts it in a very dangerous niche epidemiologically. And as you can see, seasonal flu is way down here. It's not so transmissible and it's not so fatal. So let's compare now COVID-19 versus the flu in terms of these two parameters. The R naught and the incubation time are significantly different, and this are two parameters that determine the transmissibility. Flu, as I mentioned, has a relatively low R naught. The COVID-19, SARS coronavirus 2, has a R naught at least twice that of the flu, or approximately twice that of the flu, and perhaps more than that. Another key factor in transmissibility is the incubation time. Many people who have gotten the flu may recall that they actually were exposed to someone 2 or 3 days or even the day before they started to get symptoms. With COVID-19, this incubation period can be up to 14 days, and that, of course, expands the transmissibility possibility. The second parameter is related to mortality, which can be measured, as I mentioned, by the case fatality rate and the hospitalization rate. And in COVID-19, this is at least 10 times or an order of magnitude greater than the flu. These numbers, of course, change, and there's been debate about the denominator and how many are tested and so on and so forth. I think regardless of the precise or absolute numbers, which are generally impossible to obtain anyway, we get a sense or a relative sense of the numbers, and it is clear that the mortality rate of COVID-19 is greater than that of the flu, and 10 times or more. And so that is a challenge. In addition, as mentioned, the mortality rate is significantly greater, again, about an order of magnitude greater for COVID-19. This is very important because the challenge of the disease is not just its mortality, but the fact that it uses a lot of hospital resources. And so if the epidemic is uncontrolled, the hospital system is overwhelmed, and these fatality rates can actually increase. So hospitalization is fairly important in COVID-19. I should say, just like the flu, there are, of course, people who don't die. I mean, it's a small percentage. And there are even people who are asymptomatic or very mild. So that's why I mentioned at the beginning, it's important not to panic. This is not a death sentence by any means. Ebola, for example, has a 50% fatality rate, but much lower, much more difficult to transmit. And so COVID-19 is very significant, but the majority of cases do fine. So let's focus on one of these parameters, the mortality rate, and the medical aspects. So the symptoms of COVID-19 are very diverse. It turns out that this virus is quite tricky. It can infect the GI tract, the respiratory tract, the upper respiratory tract, and so there can be a variety of symptoms. The classic ones for coronavirus are fever, a cough, in particular a dry cough, shortness of breath, which is quite specific to coronavirus, and symptoms 2 to 14 days after exposure, which may be difficult for some people to identify. Another unique symptom of COVID-19 tends to be loss of smell or taste. In flu, you have a wide variety of symptoms. Many are familiar with: fever, cough, sore throat, headaches, generalized fatigue, muscle or body aches, which are very prominent even in mild flu. Typically, the muscle or body aches are only seen in more advanced or serious coronavirus. And a runny or stuffy nose, which is not characteristic of the coronavirus, sometimes can be seen, but generally not. Of course, we are in the springtime in the northern hemisphere, so allergies are uh, a big concern. And allergies are manifested more by upper respiratory sinus sort of symptoms of sneezing, itchy, runny, or blocked nose, sinus symptoms, as I mentioned, itchy, red, or watery eyes. So why is COVID-19 so dangerous? This is a picture of the deep in the lung of the alveolus. The alveolus is the region of the lung that mediates the gas exchange where people can get their oxygen and they get rid of the carbon dioxide. So here we have air and blood, and there's a very thin barrier so that you have gas exchange. There are two types of cells in this alveolus. One is the type 1 pneumocytes, which are alveolar cells, very thin, and they are the ones which the gases actually go across. And many of the respiratory viruses, such as the flu, will infect these type 1 pneumocytes. And so you do get some serious viral pneumonia at a very small percentage, albeit with the flu. There is this another type of pneumocyte, which is rare, only 5% of the alveolar surface, the more rounded cells. These produce a very key oily film, the pulmonary surfactant, that keeps these air pockets open. If you don't have the type 2 pneumocytes, then even though it's a small number of cells, you have significantly impaired gas exchange. You have difficulty breathing. And in fact, SARS coronavirus 2 infects these critical cells, only a few number of cells. Also, it should be noted that the only way the virus is destroyed or gotten rid of is through the immune system. So the immune system actually kills infected cells. It is killing these cells as well. And since they're quite rare, one cannot lose many of them before you get some compromised respiratory function and you get an x-ray that looks like this. You don't need to be a radiologist to see that this is quite serious. So what are things that you can do? As I mentioned, the immune system is involved in clearing this virus. And the most people, the vast majority, will have mild or no symptoms. And the immune system clears it. There are some indications that how much you're exposed to, the viral load, and how many viruses can also overwhelm the system. So if you have a very slight exposure and you don't have risk factors such as cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, and diabetes and hypertension, there are all chances are you should do well. And of course, you can increase those chances by boosting your immune health. What can you do in this regard? Get enough sleep, eat more whole plant foods to improve the microbiome in the gut, eat more healthy fats to reduce inflammation, limit your added sugar. So, in general, eat healthy, sleep well, moderate exercise. The recommendations are 30 minutes at least 3 times a week by the American Heart Association. Stay hydrated, drinking water, fluids, uh, dehydration interferes with the immune system. Manage stress levels, whatever it may be, meditation, exercise, walking, depending, of course, on your lockdown or social distancing requirements. If possible, again, depending on what your local jurisdictions allow, spend time outside, avoiding crowds and people, as I mentioned, and get sunlight. Vitamin D is important for the immune system, and take a recommended dose of vitamin C. So now let's go to the second characteristic, the transmissibility, or R naught. As mentioned, SARS is right here. It is the average number of people who will catch the disease. And let's talk about transmissibility. In general, there are multiple methods that pathogens can be transmitted. And I'm going to talk generally about transmission and then zoom in on the COVID-19 virus. So there is direct transmission, person to person, close contact, or via droplets being close to that person. And those droplets are released through coughing, sneezing, or actually has been seen talking. So talking with people who might be infected is you need to keep a distance. There are indirect methods that are fecal oral. That sounds very dirty, but it's can be very surprisingly easy to spread through the toilet and the bathroom. And if you don't wash your hands, because the virus does get in the intestinal system. And also airborne. This is not the case as we know with COVID. And then fomites. Fomites are little particles or dust on surfaces. And then insect bites. And so many different viruses and bacteria and so forth will have different methods of transmission. They're not all the same. For example, HIV is basically person to person through body fluids, and in some cases by a insect vector. Highlighted here are the methods that are known with COVID-19: person to person, droplet, fecal oral, and fomites. And so this leads to specific recommendations on how to avoid this transmission. So as mentioned, aerosols and droplets carry this virus. And aerosols and droplets are, basically speaking, little bits of water, because the virus cannot survive totally on its own. It has this membrane, as I mentioned, which is quite fragile. So it has to be in some sort of water medium. It can be either large water, namely droplets, or aerosols, which are much smaller. And so these are the ranges for coughing, and about less than 2 meters, and sneezing can be up to 6 meters. So the recommendation is 2 meters in terms of talking, etc. Sneezing, which is not as big a part of COVID-19, but can be, would indicate that even further distances are important if you can, to avoid crowding. And this is one reason for the very significant lockdowns and social distancing measures that are in place, including at home as much as possible. People should be separate. So what should individuals do? Of course, follow local governmental recommendations and requirements. Bear in mind that the great majority of cases are mild and even asymptomatic. Clean hands with soap and water or an alcohol sanitizer as described here. As shown here, cover the nose and mouth with while coughing or sneezing with a tissue or flexed elbow. Most people are aware of that. Avoid close contact with anyone with cold or flu-like symptoms. Although, as I mentioned, there is a 14-day incubation period. Many people are asymptomatic. And so in general, as we know, social distancing is important. So greater than 2 meters as much as possible. Minimize time in crowds or confined spaces. Now, as I mentioned, there's an indication that the amount of virus that you're exposed to is important, the so-called viral load. So very transient exposure to a small amount of virus will likely not result in significant disease. Your immune system will clear that, and you'll be one of those asymptomatic or mild cases. Uh, we have heard of doctors and healthcare professionals, very young ones, who die of COVID 19, and they probably have significant sustained exposure to the virus. So if you happen to be in a crowd or shopping, and you should just obviously avoid that, but minimize that exposure. And if you were in that crowd and somebody was coughing nearby, of course, that is a risk, but don't panic, and follow your symptoms, and of course seek medical attention if you do get some symptoms. But the chances are very low if it's a very transient encounter. Ventilate your home and work area when possible, and keep your area and surfaces clean, as I mentioned, with alcohol wipes, with hydrogen peroxide spray, or whatever you have available. So you want to just be aware of your surroundings, what you touch. You probably notice I'm trying not to touch my face. It's very easy to do that. You're thinking and so forth. So I try to be aware of where my hands are. Now, of course, we are not all surgically trained, but you might want to just think like a surgeon. Surgeons are trained not to just randomly grab things as they keep their sterile technique. Just be aware of what doors you're opening, etc., and try to avoid that. Maybe using your shoulders, etc., to open doors. So most important, if you have cough, fever, and or difficulty breathing, the difficulty breathing is very critically related to COVID-19. Contact your medical authorities according to local requirements. In Korea, as you know, the number is 1339. What should organizations do? Again, following local governmental recommendations requirements, so that the suggestions that I give here are general and may need to be adapted for whatever is in your local jurisdiction. So to minimize or eliminate meetings, substitute with telephone or video conferences, flexible scheduling, consider different shifts to minimize overlap between people. Some companies have started at 8:30 and 9:30, 10:30 to avoid rush hour. Everybody is not there at the same time. Smaller teams, if you have some teamwork, and obviously they should be doing social distancing, don't rotate individuals among teams in order to be able to track possible infections. So keep an established team. So if somebody does get it, perhaps from outside, and they were not careful, then you can manage that and track that within that team, and follow accordingly. If there must be face-to-face meetings, minimize contact and keep a distance greater than 2 meters, and arrange the seating accordingly for that meeting. For work entrances for both customers and employees, set up temperature testing at the entrance and also ask about symptoms. Many companies in Korea are doing this, and other facilities. One novel method to consider is to do a smell test with alcohol vinegar. So, for example, the US Army in Korea, for its garrison, is now testing people's sense of smell, because that apparently also goes away early in many COVID-19 cases. Place an alcohol sanitizer in all work areas, especially near entrances, not just in the bathroom, so employees can easily wash their hands when they transit through. Increase the outside ventilation, open windows if possible. Luckily, the weather is getting more accommodating in this regard. Keep doors open. You may have a security issue, so you have to keep some doors closed, but if doors can be kept open instead of people constantly touching them, keep those doors ajar and open. Uh, Reduce air conditioning. This is relevant to hot climates, tropical zones. So in Singapore, some of the first cases occurred in hotels and malls, and authorities there have given instructions to reduce the air conditioning, because warmer weather does inhibit the virus. It should be noted that many people are saying the virus will go away by summer, but warmer weather, while it does inhibit the virus, we have seen it in tropical areas like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. So this is a very dangerous virus, and just hoping that the warmer weather will get rid of it is not a good strategy. So we have to be careful. That being said, as I mentioned, to reduce air conditioning. So for enclosed areas, use ventilation with filtration systems. Unfiltered ventilation systems should be, if possible, turned off. Replace these filters and upgrade them to the highest level as possible. Also very important for institutions, organizations to encourage a positive, supportive environment. This is, of course, the past. Team building, we don't want to do that, but we should find other ways that management can address these challenges and keep a supportive environment. Again, most important to encourage anyone with symptoms, employee or customer, to contact the appropriate medical authorities. So should I wear a mask? That's a question a lot of people are asking. I think that has been answered, but has been controversial in some areas. Everyone should wear a mask. The main reason is that, well, three reasons. One is people are asymptomatic and can still, or mildly symptomatic, can still transmit. So not just people who are actively coughing. Number two is it does offer some protection against incoming droplets. Obviously, if you have a person coughing around you and that mask gets contaminated, you need to throw that away. So it's not a perfect solution. And the third one is it gives a signal, if you will, to people around you that you are being careful and they should be careful as well. The disadvantage of masks is if people are touching it and manipulating it, potentially touching their face more or reusing the mask a significant number of times where it gets contaminated. That can be a downside or unintended consequence. So we have three types of masks: surgical, which have the least amount of protection, the KF94s, which protect against smaller particles, and then the N95 respirators. Key factors required for a respirator to be effective. We have correct methods and incorrect methods, and it should cover the nose and mouth. Most people are aware. And if there is a metal clip, that should be clipped or pressed against the outside, and try not to touch your face while applying the mask. And the same thing, taking it off and keeping it away. So for the future, organizations should be thinking in the after Corona era. Obviously now, these are some measures to resolve the issue. We want to develop resilience, both on worker thinking and cash management and so forth. Plan to return to business, reimagining the next new normal and how this can be sustainable, and to do reforms of practices, whether it be washing hands, uh, alcohol sanitizers, uh, group meetings, and so on and so forth, various best practices. Good example of this is the 2003 SARS crisis, which hit Asia. And Korea handled the SARS crisis very well in 2003. And one of the measures that they put in was to introduce soaps into the bathroom. So Korea had many bathrooms in public buildings, which was a convenience, but not all of them had soap at the sink, whether it be a liquid soap or soap bars. But after 2003, there was an intense government push. And if you go around the public bathrooms in Korea, you may take it for granted now, but there is almost always soap there. And that fact is a legacy of the reforms that were done in 2003 to handle that crisis. So thank you, and please take care. And very important, it is important not to panic. Once again, this is Ogan Gurel. You can reach me at ogangurel@gmail.com. And here is my LinkedIn account, so feel free to connect. And I appreciate the opportunity by the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea to bring this COVID-19 safety briefing to you. Please take care.